Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dyslexia Life Hacks show. I'm your host, Matthew Head, and this episode is part 2 of a 2-part series with Dean and Bodhi Bragonier of NoticeAbility. In the previous episode, I spoke to Dean's son, Bodhi, who gave us a teenage perspective on dyslexia, as well as how he fits into NoticeAbility. Now I'm talking to Dean, the founder and executive dyslexic of NoticeAbility. This is a non-profit helping students with dyslexia thrive by identifying their strengths and building their self-esteem. Dean and Bodhi are currently on a round-the-world trip promoting the positives about dyslexia as well as their program. I will link to Bodhi's episode and NoticeAbility in the show notes, which will be available at dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Welcome to the show, Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Head. Excited to be here, my friend.
Excellent. Where I wanted to kick this off with is you've swum 50 nautical miles.
Yes, not at once. Not at once. I wish everyone thought that was the case. No, it was a series of only about 2.5, 3 mile legs around the coast of Martha's Vineyard Island, located in Massachusetts waters. The idea was to generate a bit of a narrative, to build up some interest into why this guy was swimming around an island that is known probably most famously as the set of Jaws, the movie, and actually hosts the real live great whites in abundance to this day. And so I thought that that backdrop would create a conversation that I could share with those interested in seeing if I would be eaten or survive. And once I had their attention, introduce the concept of this strength-based approach, or the strength-based perspectives of dyslexia, and how I wanted to start an organization that would help students with dyslexia understand these advantages better.
Yeah. One thing I was really curious when I was reading about this, like when I find I'm prepping for any sort of athletic endeavor or anything that involves a lot of brain power, I've sort of realized there's a bit of a voice in my head that kind of overcomplicates it. And I think that's sometimes my dyslexia going off on a spin. And when I sort of breathe, relax and realize what it is and get refocused, like riding motorcycles or whatever, suddenly it becomes a lot more fluid. Do you tend to find that thing when you're training for a big event like that, your mind's eye just flies off and starts thinking of all of this complicated stuff it really doesn't need to worry about?
Yeah, it does, but I guess I see that same characteristic as kind of an exciting opportunity. I mean, it's I was training for that swim for the winter preceding it. Which meant waking up at about 5 a.m. in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, and showing up at the Harvard pool at 5:30 and swimming for an hour and 15 minutes and doing about 2.5 miles in that time. And so you've got a lot of time to think about why you're doing this, what you're doing it for, and how you can make it better. And it was truthfully, I annoyed the coach, because I would ask him to jot down on the whiteboard where the practice is written a couple of ideas that I would have every few laps. So he became my scribe, which was not what he had signed up for. But I saw these as, these opportunities. I mean, I would have these insights about, the correlation between my stroke efficacy and how much was on my mind. And that was an interesting insight, for example. But then I would see or think of ways that I could utilize this opportunity to promote certain collaborations, or ways that I could weave in certain sponsors to benefit their marketing as well as highlighting our efforts. And so, yes, I get bombarded. It's like driving in fifth gear and you're still redlining. You're stressing your engine, but it's exciting too.
Yes. No, it is interesting how you can sort of, the brain is spinning at high speed, and you can, as long as you've kind of harness it, you start grabbing all the cool stuff that's coming. Hey, yes, I'll do that. But now let's get back to the task in town. I'll get something to tab that, like I do in my car, and get the voice control to write notes in my phone as I'm thinking of something. Oh,
This would be great. Exactly. And the key, I think this is actually, occupational hazard or just lifestyle hazard of the dyslexic is that because we have so many fascinating ideas and thoughts, it's like if we don't build in downtime, we can burn out.
Yes.
We can really burn out quickly.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, very much so. So I want to take it to the beginning and understand how yourself found out that you were dyslexic and how did you work it out, basically?
Well, I had a lot of benefits that most people don't have. I had a mother who is a child developmental psychologist and a father who presented as dyslexic. And when we ultimately got me tested, he was diagnosed as well. And so there was a level of awareness and an understanding of what dyslexia was to begin with. And I say that was very fortunate because even now, 48 years later, the general understanding of dyslexia is lacking. And so I was extremely fortunate to have that home environment. I think that my mother feels a level of regret that she wasn't even more proactive, although I tell her that getting me diagnosed by the age of 8 years old when I was born in 1973 is the most accelerated progressive agenda you could ever ask for. But I think that she started to see me struggle even before then and wishes that she had been even more proactive. Which goes, and I don't mean to be shooting off in a different direction, but I think that's a common theme that we come into contact with is parents who regret not being more proactive, not doing more earlier. And I usually say to those parents, the fact that you're discussing it with me, right, after a talk and we're doing a Q&A is evidence that they are already ahead of the curve.
Yeah,
they're seeking out, they're listening to this podcast. Which is a incredibly proactive thing to do. So the guilt is while I understand it, does not need to necessarily be shouldered for any longer.
No, I agree. I think it is quite good. If you are proactive, it doesn't matter when you find out your child is, or whether you find out yourself is dyslexic, doing something now and moving forwards always wins.
Yeah. Yep. Couldn't say it better myself.
So, we spoke to Bodhi last week about the American school system and how he found dyslexia in that school system and how dyslexia is in America. Now, obviously, you being a touch older than Bodhi, because he's your son, how was it back in your day?
I'm sure Bod's had plenty of colorful things to say about the educational
very
system.
Much did, yeah.
Yeah. Thank God he doesn't have to go into a school that he's just been trash talking. It's the U.S. school system, unfortunately, has not changed much since I was a kid. And I think that, again, it's difficult for me to parse out what was family understanding and what was school understanding back in the 70s and early 80s. But I will say this, that, a cognizant parent who becomes a child's advocate makes 100% all the difference. And it's largely because the bureaucratic structure of public education is not dyslexic friendly. It's not incentivized to be dyslexic friendly from a financial perspective. And this is the United States speaking, based largely on the federal and state laws that mandate equal opportunity and education for all people, regardless of their learning profile, which means that if you are a parent of a child with dyslexia and you convince the school to give your child the neuropsychological evaluation that they are legally required to give, even if your child is dyslexic, there is a very low probability that the word dyslexia will appear in the diagnosis. And the reason for that, and this is dark and sinister, and unfortunately it comes from, the mouths of a lot of experts who know more about this than I do, is because the moment that you use the word dyslexia, it triggers federal laws in the United States that mandate evidence-based reading remediation. That evidence-based reading remediation, like Orton Gillingham or many, many similar programs, comes at a much higher financial cost to the school.
Right.
Therefore, if the school diagnoses a child with a specific learning disability or a language-based learning disability, they are able to provide, I'll use the word garbage, remediation, which actually many will argue is more detrimental than it is beneficial.
Mm.
So that is the dark and ugly underbelly of American education. And I don't know how much of that existed. I don't think that the Individualized Education Act, IDEA, was, I don't remember what year it was instituted or passed in the United States, but I think it was after my early years of education. But the point being is that law and application of law are two very different subjects.
Yeah, it can be really tricky. So obviously you would have got some sort of intervention, sounds particularly from your parents' side rather than necessarily the school system. What sort of things, thinking back, did they apply to you at that point? And did you notice a step change in your ability to learn afterwards?
I did. And I think that I went to a reading specialist before I transitioned into private school. But this is the primary distinction in the United States is public education versus private education. Mm. And for your audience, I'm sure you're familiar with those terms, but public is government funded, private is parent funded. And the reality is that in a private education institute, you're much more likely to get that evidence-based reading intervention that a dyslexic needs in order to learn this skill set. Mm. However, it requires money to send the kid to a private school. I mean, it certainly wasn't the case in the 80s, but today, a dyslexic-specific private school in the United States hovers on the most conservative end, $30,000 US a year. On the more higher end in urban settings is more like 70,000 US a year. So you've got to ask yourself how many families are able to afford that additional expense. Yeah. And the answer is very few. So for me to get that intervention, while it was profoundly humiliating, to be led out of class with all the other kids who were dyslexic and our heads hung low and wishing and hoping that nobody knew where we were going, but the reality is everyone did.
Yeah.
Going to the little room, and it's always a dark room, and it's always in a basement. It's always got small desks and small chairs, and it's uncomfortable and ridiculous. But
same over here.
Yeah. Mrs. Chadwick, she got me up and running. And of course it doesn't mean I kick back with a, 400-page novella or novel and read that today. But at least I can get through my emails. And if I want to pleasure read for 5 minutes before I sleep, then great, I can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great you had the intervention early. And I think it does really help because you went to college, didn't you, as well? I think I read on your profile.
I did.
How did you find that experience? Obviously, the shift from school into college.
Well, college, aka university, in your world is, there are many of them and many different profiles and many different value propositions for that upper level of education in the United States. I chose what is characterized as a private liberal arts college, which means that you don't go and study medicine or law or business. What you do is you get this generalized education that pulls from history and psychology and the sciences, et cetera. And you come out arguably a more creative or holistic thinker, but far less specialized for the workplace.
Yeah. But
the college that I went to, which I say with pride and it's applicable to this subject matter, is, top 20 in the United States is, these private liberal arts colleges, was incredibly competitive to get into. And the fact that they accepted me was the first point of positive affirmation that I had ever received from the educational system that I was worthwhile. This was a competitive institution that had no obligation to take me, and they did. And that fact alone To this day, I can remember opening that acceptance letter and having every nerve in my body quivering at the fact that I was accepted.
Yes.
But what I found so particularly empowering was the fact that when I got there, you got to remember that these are kids that are, in many cases turning down the Ivy League schools because they want this liberal education, are incredibly intelligent, and to listen to them and to know that someone thought that I should be in their audience was extraordinary. And furthermore, the main currency in an institution like Bates College is creativity and knowledge synthesis. And that is, ironically, that is the sort of wheelhouse for the dyslexic mind. And so being surrounded by people like that and being able to start to flex those aspects of my mind that had never been accessed by education prior to Bates was a very empowering situation. And the last thing I'll say, and this is actually to answer your question, which you asked me 25 minutes ago, which was, what was the transition like? The transition was remarkable. I remember that within the first couple of weeks that I was on the campus, somebody approached me literally out on campus and said, "Excuse me, I understand that you had untimed SATs, which is the admissions test that we need to take in the United States. You're dyslexic. Well, I represent the college, and we would like to pay a student of your choosing to take notes for you. We would like to pay a student of your choosing to tutor you. And lastly, it goes without saying that you will have untimed exams in any class you take." And that level of proactivity on behalf of an educational institution was mind-blowing.
Yes, most definitely.
I felt like some VIP. I really did.
So was that really the point that you shifted from deficit thinking and having negative thoughts about your dyslexia to, hey, there's something to this and I do fit in? Because I found when I went to uni, it's like, wow, I'm still with all the academics. This is cool. And they haven't noticed me yet. And as I step through, it's like, no, I deserve to be here.
Right. Yeah. It's, I think that sometimes in the back of my mind, I thought there might have been an administrative error that I got in, right? Like, it's how did I get here kind of thing. But I think that, yes, it was the first step on the journey to becoming empowered in regard to my dyslexia and the way I thought and see the world. I think it wasn't until really after college that I became a small business entrepreneur. And it was in the restaurant business, and that's a business where, something like 65% of the people that actually know what they're doing fail in the first 3 years. And I didn't know at all what I was doing, and bought this little seasonal restaurant. And after 5 years, definitely categorized it as a successful exit. I mean, I sold the restaurant at a profit. And I think it was the fact that I was able to cut my teeth in real life business and succeed, albeit moderately. I mean, I'm not talking about a Silicon Valley exit or anything. I'm just saying that it was more successful than not. And that was like, your customers don't lie. Your customers don't come in and say, "Oh, I hear you're dyslexic, so I'm going to spend my money here because I feel badly for you." They don't care. They want their meal hot and tasty, right? Yeah. And if you don't give it to them, you're not going to get dollars in the till at the end of the day. And so this is really kind of irrefutable evidence that the way I saw the world was advantageous, especially when it came to entrepreneurship.
Yes. Yeah, the dyslexic thinking comes into that. And as you say, like going into an industry that's super competitive, but using your strengths to your advantage to be able to make the business work is pretty admirable. I'm building up to talking about young Bodhi, I guess the boy wonder. But one thing I wanted to touch on first is you refer to him as a thoroughbred dyslexic, or purebred dyslexic, sorry, because your wife, Sally, is also dyslexic. So I'm thinking about how the two of you would have met, realized you're both dyslexic, and then can compare notes of how you two are the same or how different you are, because no two of us are the same, and you've got a household full of 3 dyslexics.
No, it was really, it became, I think that when Sally and I met, we discovered that we were both dyslexic the first, date that we went on. I think it was part of our life description, and it was one of those realizations where you just, there's a ton of assumed knowledge that you then have about the person that you're speaking with. You know that they have gone through hardships. You know that they have a level of resilience. You know that they have extraordinary talents. And you also know that there are some really shared vulnerabilities. When, I think as a couple or as a 3-person family, we take it for granted the level of creativity that we kind of marinate in on a daily basis. I mean, literally, my Bodhi will over breakfast usually come up with a business idea that could be implemented in the restaurant we're sitting in to make the experience better for the client. And then Sally will look at something and say, if I painted a picture of what this scene looks like, I would use it in sepia-toned colored paints. And I will go off in a totally different direction. I think to anybody who's listening that's not dyslexic, overhearing our conversation in the restaurant would just say, like, these people are either like incredibly fascinating or completely out of their minds. But either way, for us, like, we're having a blast, right? We're like, it's, speaking or living with a fellow dyslexic. If you understand the dyslexic nuance and how we think, you basically fasten your seatbelt because you know that every conversation is going to be a wild ride. Mm-hmm. It really is. Like, I have many, many meetings day in and day out. And when I know I'm having a dyslexic, that I'm meeting with a fellow dyslexic, I take a deep breath, I get a cup of coffee, I go to the bathroom, and I sit down and I prepare myself for a roller coaster.
Yes.
We're gonna discuss like space technology and like how to solve global hunger and why it is that LED lighting never gives off the same hue as the old classic light bulb. We're going to talk about it all. And it's just, that's fascinating to me. And
yes.
that's pretty much our daily routine.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I've always got a vision that you've met your wife, Sally, and you're sat in a restaurant and you're both trying to fish to read the menu. And then you realize that both of you are like, But when conversation started, and I noticed this, we were obviously all at the Dyslexia show, and there's 4 dyslexic people sat on one table. And that's my first experience of sitting on a table with purely dyslexic people, and how the conversation in my mind floats in this ball of vision above the table, and we just throw stuff around and it spins and it goes. And there's none of that drop into fully visualizing it because everybody else already has done that. So, and then it just, over 3 hours, we did about 10 hours worth of conversation, I think.
Exactly. And, they also, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in people with dyslexia is that there's an incredible level of compassion and empathy for your fellow person. And I think that is largely due to the fact that we know what it feels like to be misunderstood and ostracized and to not feel as if we fit in. And as a result, we have great levels of empathy for people, regardless of what their experience is, because the human experience is marked by suffering. I mean, that's coming from the Buddhist perspective, but which I am. But the idea that we can sit at that table, and I had never met you. I had obviously met Darren before, but getting up after 3 hours and knowing that Matt Head is one of my buddies, like genuinely. Like, we may not go and see each other for 10 years, but when we do, we're going to pick up where we started. And that camaraderie, I'm not sure where it comes from. I don't know if it's innate. I don't know if it's an environmental byproduct of living a life as a person with dyslexia. But I feel most at home and engaged and thoughtful and cared for when I'm with people with dyslexia.
Yeah. Well, that is a really nice way of putting that. And I encourage people who are dyslexic and maybe are the odd one out, maybe to try and find some other dyslexics to talk to. And hopefully you get that kind of feeling just listening into our conversation on this podcast as well. I want to move to Bodhi. So we obviously covered last episode with Bodhi and his experience and pocket change and how that started to trigger you into founding NoticeAbility. Now, you would have watched Bodhi grow, and you obviously, between you and Sally, you're pretty certain that he's very likely to be dyslexic. It'd be surprising if he's not, wouldn't it? And how were you sort of noticing him develop? Were you keeping tabs on him as a very young child to see if he did show the traits?
Yes, but not in the way that you may be asking. I mean, I was looking for the advantages from day one. Okay, where does his dyslexic ingenuity lie? And knowing that the school system was going to do a terrific job of pointing out where the deficits existed, I was constantly on the lookout for where his advantages would present. And one of them, as I'm sure he demonstrated on this podcast, is the kid knows how to talk. He loves to speak.
Yes, he does. You may have noticed that.
Yeah. Probably not too much unlike his old man, but it's just noticing his ability to speak. I very quickly put him into a position of being able to share his thoughts and articulate them in a way where people would be allowed to give him that time, would allow him that time. And, I think he did his first public talk when he was like 7 years old or something. And I was terrified. I thought, you never want to put your kid in that position, because all of a sudden what happens if he just gets up there and freezes, then it's going to be a really negative experience. But he got up and he's 7. We got a video of it. It's hysterical. And he's like, I want to thank you all for coming. I know you've got busy schedules. And I was like, did a 7-year-old just say that? Like, okay, good way to start. Okay. And, he goes off into this diatribe. And of course, he, even at 7, he throws a couple of tongue-in-cheek comments at his old man, which is, always endears yourself to the audience, right? And, I just saw that as he got off that, it was a porch. I mean, it wasn't a stage or anything. It was a porch for a gathering of 25 adults or something. But he just had a strut in his step. His little chest was puffed out, and he had just like, he was styling. And and that, convinced me, like, okay, I can't give that to him. All I can do is create opportunities for him to see that in himself. Yeah. And that's really what I think we have done with Bodhi, is knowing what advantages to look for, and then trying to create opportunities for him to see how good he is at those things.
Yeah.
And then the rest is up to him.
Yeah. So is it that event that really triggered your mind to setting up the NoticeAbility as well? Or was there another sort of event that really spun you into doing that out? Because obviously you're basically doing the program on Bodhi, and then you think, hang on, I can grow this into something else.
Yes, well, he was actually so the precursor to that, which goes back to the story of pocket change, which was the impetus behind starting NoticeAbility, as I'm sure he said. He creates this little business idea, and then we sit down and I go to the Small Business Association website, which is sort of a government run startup website for individuals, and I start filling in his answers to a proper business plan template, and to be able to deliver a printed copy of a business plan to a kid who is then, I think, about 6 years old, and to say, Bodhi, this is like, this is what proper entrepreneurs create. And you have created that at 6 years old, was, I think, an incredibly affirming experience. So, so presenting Bodhi with a printed out business plan that he had created was an epiphany, I think, as much for me as it was for him. Because I saw his reaction. He went and then would get cardboard boxes and created a little storefront. And my mother at one point said, how are you going to handle this? Because, renting retail space in the town that we live in is very expensive, but he seems to have his heart set on it. Like, how are you going to pop that bubble? Right. I just prayed that he wasn't looking for real estate in Cambridge, but, yeah. Can't afford that, babe. But but what it proved out was the fact that he held the keys to his own empowerment. I just had to support him to do that. And so, living in Cambridge, literally, blocks away from Harvard, MIT, and knowing professors there allowed me to sort of just spitball this idea of sort of codifying what I had done with Bodhi into an actual entrepreneurship class that could bring that same moment of pride and that boost to self-esteem to students who needed it, who desperately needed it. And that was really the genesis behind NoticeAbility. And then realizing that, the more I spent my time and efforts on this, the more Bodhi would be exposed to it. And therefore, the more I would be encouraging him in his realization of his self-efficacy. And, as you well said, he was, when you and I met, he was about to give a keynote the next day, on a stage in a different country. That's pretty cool for a 14-year-old.
Yeah. Bodhi's ability to talk is brilliant, and we're having a few technical issues this end. So if Dean's voice changes during the recording, hopefully it doesn't sound too bad. So yeah, as I was saying, Bodhi was really impressive when I met him at Dyslexia Show. If I didn't see that he was a 14-year-old and just heard his voice, I would think he's much more mature, and he's really clever with the way he pulled people out of the audience and came into things. How are you rolling your experience with Bodhi into the NoticeAbility program?
Creating NoticeAbility classes based solely on my experience with Bodhi was limited, because I know Bodhi, I know where his advantages lie, and I knew how to tease them out based on my knowledge of him as my son and as a person. However, the larger sort of spectrum of dyslexic talents are highlighted in a book called The Dyslexic Advantage. And what these two neuroscientists have done is identified these cognitive traits that we have and highlighted those careers where these advantages play out most specifically. And as a result, dyslexics are disproportionately successful. So we've spoken about entrepreneurship, which is certainly one of them. And like you, engineering is another. Architecture and the arts comprise 4 of, 24 professions where dyslexics tend to do better than most in. But we wanted to focus on those 4 because they are the best subject matters to apply to the different cognitive reasoning. These professions sort of tease out these dyslexic advantages the best way possible. And so what we did is we, as I said earlier, approached Harvard and MIT, where I know these professors, and I said, look, can you allocate some graduate students to help me create courses where we as an organization teach entrepreneurship or engineering or architecture or the arts. And we use that as a backdrop for these students to see and witness where their dyslexic advantages lie. And furthermore, how to build upon them, how to strengthen these advantages, not necessarily because we want to create future entrepreneurs or engineers or architects or artists. That may be a byproduct, but more specifically to introduce this strength-based narrative to these students when they desperately need it. And when I say desperately need it, we've identified that the ages of approximately 10 to 14 years old are really the sweet spot. That's when, theoretically, a student has received the reading remediation they need, but they haven't gotten into what we call high school, that age range of about 14 to 17, 18 years old, when psychologists say we really formulate the personalities that we carry through life. So it seems like this last opportunity to inject or to inoculate the students against this perpetual negative self-dialogue. I'm dumb, I'm broken, I can't read, I can't spell, and illuminate them to the very significant silver lining associated with dyslexia. And once our programs were able to sort of engage these students, much the way Bodhi felt engaged in pocket change and public speaking, we can then provide them with what's known in the United States as social emotional learning. A fancy word for essentially how do we operate in team environments? How does the individual negotiate and problem solve and resolve conflict? I mean, all the skills that we as adults use on a daily basis. This is called social emotional learning. And so that's really what we're trying to do is create a palatable conduit for these students to receive social emotional learning in a way that would resonate with them. And what better way than to highlight and share with them what they're good at and how it applies to their future.
Yes. So you're almost using the professions that dyslexics are good at as a bit of a Trojan horse to then learn all the other skills that then empower them to be
100%. You're absolutely right. What we're trying to do is we're trying to bake the medicine into the brownie. The social emotional learning being the medicine, the brownie being the strength-based approach. And it's, the kids gobble it up because they're desperate for an alternate narrative to the one that they currently have, which is they're stupid and useless. And what's nice is it's not superficial, you're great, Einstein was dyslexic, you can be Einstein. It's not that. It's giving them an opportunity to engage in exercises where they cannot ignore what they are good at. And I think that genuine self-confidence is the only way to mitigate the downward trajectory that a lot of students are forced into as a result of not fitting into the traditional school system.
I agree. And I found that the more confident and sure-footed I am in things that I'm really good at, that I actually almost that is the tide that raises all ship and spills into stuff that maybe I'm a bit weaker at and actually makes me want to work it out a little bit more or feel less negative about it. And I can just carry on.
You're absolutely right. And, I love that dyslexics and you're proving out the stereotype is that we dyslexics love to speak in analogy. You've already used Trojan horse, rising tide carries all boats. You're absolutely right. Is that when we feel genuinely confident, we are able to acknowledge and laugh off the areas of challenge because we've got something to counterbalance the negativity. If all we do is are exposed to what we're bad at, it's very hard not to take it incredibly personally and feel really defeated. But when you feel good about yourselves in other ways, it creates a counterbalance to that negative talk.
Yes, I agree. So you're currently taking this message around the world. How are you finding that tour and bumping into dyslexic people from completely different cultures?
The Magellan campaign, and we call it Magellan because Magellan, of course, proved that the Earth was not flat; it was three-dimensional. And we are trying to provide proof that dyslexia is not a two-dimensional deficit-based only description, but in actuality has myriad dimensions. As introducing a holistic approach to understanding dyslexia. what is extraordinary is not only meeting students with dyslexia from obviously different countries and cultures, but also witnessing the learning about the educational systems in which they're educated and identifying areas that are both challenging to the dyslexic, namely places like the UK, which obviously has a tremendous amount of testing built into its educational system, and others. While we haven't visited any Scandinavian countries yet, but they are reputed. They are reputed to be incredibly embracing of the whole child development, and so just to be able to swoop in and get a bird's eye perspective of how these different cultures interact, and then, albeit subjective, but to project upon that a correlation between how those school systems impact the disposition of the students we're working with is absolutely fascinating. We, for example, went into, I'll keep it ambiguous to keep identities protected, but we went into one country which is known to be very rigorous and can be quite punitive of the dyslexic in the classroom. And when we were working with these are students that are incredibly reserved, who are incredibly shy. And I'm not talking about one or two, I'm talking about 15. And it was almost, it's not scientific, but it was very easy to see a correlation between what I knew of the educational system and the clear psychological impact that it was having on the students that we were working with that day. And that's both scary, because while we're trying to make change, we're a small organization. We're not a government that can do sweeping sort of bureaucratic improvements. But it is fascinating indeed to see where certain countries are doing it right, and other countries where they could easily improve, in my opinion.
Yes, it's great that it's great for you as a learning opportunity, but it's great that you're taking your program into other countries.
To go back to your Trojan horse analogy, which of course I love and use frequently, is the fact that reading intervention programs are a lightning rod for educational administrators. It's a very, very contentious issue, and it's wrapped up into law and implication and training and all sorts of things. What is nice about what NoticeAbility does is it targets the social, psychological, emotional disposition of the student with dyslexia. And it's very, very rare that I meet an administrator who doesn't agree that is an area of concern, regardless of what reading program is instituted or what laws are on the books. Generally speaking, most teachers, parents, students, and administrators can agree that these are students who are emotionally suffering. When NoticeAbility comes in and says, listen, we're not here to wag a finger at you and tell you you're providing the wrong reading instruction. We're here to simply try to elevate the emotional disposition of the students that we're talking about. We get a very warm reception. It's not very contentious. Most people can agree that improvements in self-esteem and academic tenacity will benefit not only the student, but the school in general. And so to be able to come in with this very collaborative, complementary approach seems to open doors to institutions that may otherwise be quite apprehensive. And that is one of the greatest benefits, and that is why I liken NoticeAbility in many ways to a Trojan horse for the field of dyslexia.
Yes, it's definitely a great thing that it's doing, and I think it's brilliant how you're addressing that kind of social side of it and leaving the other side to something else. But it definitely does grow people's experience. So what I want to move on to now is that I'm going to sort of start rounding out the podcast. I like to finish the podcast with 3 rapid fire questions. They don't need quick answers from you, but they're quick questions from me. So hopefully Bodhi hasn't told you what these are, so we get fresh answers from you rather than you cheating and asking Bodhi.
Bodhi has not told me the questions. He takes secrecy very, very seriously.
So cool. So Bodhi has kept the covenant I negotiated with him last time. So question number 1. What prejudice have you had about dyslexia that has been proven wrong?
One sort of preconceived idea around dyslexia that I didn't necessarily note it in myself. I guess I did. But I'd certainly heard from others is that people with dyslexia are slow, right? That we're slow learners, that we are slow processors. And one of the best answers to that question actually comes from the authors of the Dyslexic Advantage. And, the great irony is that we began this podcast by talking about what it's like to get a deluge of ideas and insights when we're hot on a topic, right? We talked about that.
Yes, we did.
That, it's very hard to reconcile that anecdotal data against this notion of being slow. I don't think if you're slow, you feel overwhelmed by ideas. I think that's counterintuitive. And so the authors of the Dyslexic Advantage have the most beautiful explanation, and it resonates so deeply with me personally, is that the dyslexic doesn't have a problem processing information. The dyslexic has a difficult time discerning which of the myriad options or answers that they have is applicable to the question being asked. My wife, who is brilliant, would constantly in high school get asked these questions on essays, and even Bodhi in elementary school would get these questions asked on tests, and he would be able to spit back about 12 different possible answers. And my response to him is, Bodhi, you're answering like a dyslexic. You got to dumb yourself down a little bit and answer as the teacher wants you to. And he goes, are you kidding me? And I'm like, no, man, that's really what they want. They just want that really silly, plain, straightforward answer. He's like, well, that's not very creative. I know it's not creative, but that's what they want. So it's not that the dyslexic is slow. It's that the dyslexic just basically has a Wikipedia page to every question asked. And they just have to discern which one you want. And that, so when they're staring out the window after you've asked them a question, in my mind, they're just going through a Rolodex of answers that they can provide to you, and they're just choosing which one you really want to hear.
Yes. And particularly in a school environment, it's, which one you want to hear and which one doesn't get me in trouble.
Exactly. And how sad that that's called education.
Yeah, it's a shame, isn't it? So the next question is, if an alien come down and asked you what dyslexia was, how would you describe it to them?
If an alien came down and asked me what dyslexia was, how would I describe it? I'd first of all say you are as slender and green as I always thought you were. Compliments, share your diet tips with me. But secondly, what I would say is this. You, as an alien, this is from a different planet, represent a higher intelligence than anything you're going to find here. That being said, I can assure you that the human population is evolving, and we are making progress, albeit slowly, but surely we're making progress. Dyslexia is a learning profile that you should keep your eye on, because some of the greatest innovations that will come are from people with this unique learning profile. Now, we have this antiquated communication process called the written word. It's being predominantly phased out, at least on a day-to-day basis, as people use their little mini computers in their pockets called their cell phones, and they watch videos instead of reading articles, and they see graphs instead of mulling through, white papers. But you, Mr. Alien, can rest assured that historically, these dyslexic people, while struggling in that aspect, have demonstrated that they are some of the most effective change agents of our species. And so I know, Mr. Alien, you're concerned about the fact that we're heating our planet and that we've got hunger around the world and that we've got problems that appear unsolvable. This education will be addressing and solving those problems that haven't yet been addressed.
Wow, what a cool answer. Okay, my final question, and seeing as this is the Dyslexia Life Hacks show, and you're not allowed to answer NoticeAbility, is what is your favorite dyslexia life hack?
Yeah, damn it. I can't answer NoticeAbility. Hey, my favorite dyslexia life hack. Well, it hasn't been existed, but it's match.com for people with dyslexia so that they can find dyslexic spouses. Because we need to keep pumping out dyslexics in order to support the evolution of humanity, but that doesn't yet exist. So I'd say that my favorite dyslexic life hack has to be Grammarly. It's, I don't have any stake in the company, so it's not a sponsored answer. I really do think that it does an exceptional job helping us tackle an area of weakness. It is to students today what spell check was to students like you and me, 25, 35 years ago. Some may say, well, it's cheating. Well, today, if you turn in a paper with spelling mistakes, the teacher says, didn't you spell check? It's a given now. Grammarly, you may say, is, AI is generating your content. Say, well, it's mitigating a disability. It's mitigating a challenge that I have, so I can spend more time relishing in the advantages of my learning profile.
Yes, excellent. That is a great hack, and it's something I should use more often. I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show today. And is there anything else you'd like to add before you sign off?
Matt, I'd like to thank you sincerely for having me on the podcast, and more importantly, for having Bodhi on the podcast. When you look at the role that he and I can play in the future evolution of understanding dyslexia, making it acceptable, and better yet, making it heralded for the value that it does bring to people, his voice is far more important than mine. You and I will do a lot of work during our lifetime, but it's the next generation that will carry this torch. And I really appreciate your receptivity in having him do a podcast. I would say this for anybody who knows, loves, or is interested in people with dyslexia. We are a highly investable population. Not only are we investable because it is right that every person has an equal opportunity to be educated, but more importantly, we have a historical track record of generating enormous value to society at large. And I mean it sincerely, that if more people with dyslexia are able to access the education they deserve, the more change agents we will have in the future and the less problems we will face. So thank you for doing your share by creating this podcast and for having a couple of dyslexic Americans on board.
No worries. Well, thank you very much for taking the time, and I've really enjoyed this. It's been good fun doing a two-part with yourself and Bodhi. And I want to thank everybody else for taking the time to listen, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Goodbye for now.